Nobody tells you this part. Everyone talks about healing like it's this beautiful, peaceful arrival. Like one day you wake up and suddenly everything feels light and soft and easy. They talk about healing like it's a destination, like you board a train. You sit back, you watch the old pain drift past the window, and then the doors open and you step out into this new version of yourself who finally has it all together. And maybe that's what you were promised. Maybe that's what you were working toward. But here's what actually happens. Here is what nobody in the healing space talks about, because it's uncomfortable, because it's confusing, and because it directly contradicts the version of healing they're selling you. When a real empathy heals, not surface level heals, not read a book and journal twice heals, but genuinely deeply nervous system level heals, they become someone that most people around them do not recognize. And not in the glowing, inspiring way you might imagine, in a way that feels strange, in a way that makes people who have known you for years look at you and say, something is different about you. Not always as a compliment, sometimes as an accusation. You will lose people. You will be called cold. You will be called selfish. You will be told that you used to be so understanding, so available, so easy to talk to. And you will stand there and feel something you were never supposed to feel. You will feel okay about it, not cruel, not numb, okay? That okayness will confuse you more than anything else, because somewhere inside you, you were taught that being a good person means hurting when someone says you've hurt them. You were taught that sensitivity is proof of goodness. And healing quietly, slowly begins to dismantle that belief at the foundation. So before we go any further, I want to say something clearly. What a healed empath actually becomes is not what the internet tells you. It is not a softer version of yourself. It is not someone who finally stops crying at sad movies or stops feeling things deeply. It is something far more powerful, far more grounded, and far more threatening to the people who depended on the old version of you. By the end of this video, I want you to understand exactly what that is, not as a concept, not as a motivational quote to screenshot, but as a lived, felt, cellular truth that shifts how you see every relationship in your life. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with what most people are actually describing when they call themselves an empath, because here is the thing, and this might sting a little, so stay with me. The word empath has become one of the most misunderstood, misused, and honestly, most weaponized words in the self-help world. And I say that with complete compassion because I understand why. When you grow up in an environment where emotions are unpredictable, where the mood in the room can shift without warning, where you learn very early that your safety depends on reading other people accurately, you become extraordinarily good at sensing things. You become a human emotional radar. You walk into a room and you feel the tension before anyone has spoken a single word. You sense that someone is upset even when they're smiling. You pick up the weight behind a silence. You get praise for this. People tell you that you're so intuitive, so understanding, so perceptive. And you are. But what nobody names for you is why. Nobody sits you down and says, the reason you can read a room so precisely is because you had to. The reason your nervous system is calibrated to catch microsignals is because at some point in your life, missing those signals had consequences. Instead, you grow up believing this is simply who you are, a gift, a personality trait, a superpower. And so you build your entire identity around it. You become the one who understands, the one who holds space, the one people call at 2 a.m., the one who absorbs and carries and translates and soothes, and it works for a while. It works because it keeps you connected. It works because it makes you valuable. It works because as long as you are useful to people, as long as you are emotionally indispensable, you are not abandoned. And that right there is the truth underneath the empath identity that most content in this space refuses to say out loud. For many people, being an empath is not just a personality trait. It is a survival strategy dressed up as sensitivity. It is hypervigilance that has been romanticized. It is the nervous system's response to early instability, wearing the costume of spiritual gifting. And I want to be absolutely clear, this does not make you broken. This does not mean your sensitivity is fake. This does not mean the depth of what you feel is not real. It is real. It is profound. And it is also, in many cases, exhausting in a way that goes bone deep. The kind of exhausting you don't admit to, because admitting it feels like betraying who you are. You lie awake at night not because you're anxious exactly, but because you're still carrying 17 other people's emotional weight, and you don't even notice you're doing it anymore. You cancel your own needs so reflexively it doesn't even register as a choice. You shrink, you adjust, you explain yourself endlessly. You apologize for things that are not your fault. You make yourself smaller and smaller until one day you look in the mirror and realize you cannot find yourself in there at all. That is where healing begins, not at the peak, in the collapse. In the moment your nervous system finally sends the bill for years of emotional labor it was never supposed to carry. And what comes next, what actually comes next when a real empath begins to heal, is what this entire video is about. Here is what they do not put on the Healing Journey brochure. The first real sign that you are healing, not performing healing, not consuming healing content, but actually changing at the level of your nervous system, is that things get harder before they get easier. Relationships that felt comfortable start feeling wrong. Dynamics you thought were normal start feeling suffocating. People you have loved for years start feeling like too much. And the most disorienting part is that nothing outside of you has changed. They are behaving exactly the way they always have. The difference is that you are no longer willing to disappear so that everyone else can feel comfortable. And the world around you does not know what to do with that. Let's talk about what is actually happening in your body when this begins. For years, possibly decades, your nervous system has been running a specific program. Scan the room, detect the threat, neutralize it. The threat in this case was not physical danger. It was emotional tension, disapproval, conflict, abandonment, and neutralizing it meant making yourself smaller, more agreeable, more available, more accommodating. Your nervous system learned that the fastest route to safety was to manage the emotions of the people around you. And it became so efficient at this that you stopped experiencing it as a choice. It was just who you were. It was just what love looked like. So when you begin to heal, when you start to actually regulate your own nervous system, instead of regulating everyone else's, what happens first is not peace. What happens first is alarm, because your nervous system has spent so long in that scanning, managing, neutralizing pattern that stillness feels wrong. Calm feels suspicious. Not helping feels dangerous. You sit with someone's discomfort and don't rush to fix it, and your whole body screams at you. Your chest tightens. Your hands want to reach out. Your mouth wants to explain, justify, soften, smooth it over, and doing nothing. Just letting someone else sit in their own feelings without making it your emergency feels like the most unnatural thing you have ever done. That feeling is not a sign you are doing it wrong. That feeling is withdrawal. You are withdrawing from one of the most deeply conditioned patterns your nervous system has ever run. And withdrawal is supposed to be uncomfortable. But here's where it gets more complicated, because it is not just your own discomfort you have to navigate. It is theirs. The moment you stop being emotionally available in the way you always were, the people in your life respond. And they do not always respond kindly. The person who used to call you 5 times a day to process their anxiety suddenly says you seem distant. The friend who relied on you to carry every difficult conversation suddenly says you've changed. The partner who counted on you to smooth every conflict suddenly says you don't care as much as you used to. And each one of those statements lands like a small blade because they are designed not intentionally, but effectively to pull you back, to remind you of who you were supposed to be, to reactivate the guilt that kept the old pattern running. And guilt is the single most powerful weapon against healing empath, not anger, not rejection, guilt, because guilt speaks in your own voice. It does not come from outside you and announce itself as manipulation. It rises up from the inside and sounds like conscience. It says you are being selfish. It says you used to be so much kinder. It says, look how much you are hurting them. And because you are a person who genuinely cares, because your sensitivity is real, your love is real, you listen, you second guess yourself, you wonder whether healing has just made you cold, whether the boundary you drew was too harsh, whether the distance you created was cruelty disguised as growth. You start negotiating with yourself. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should just explain one more time. Maybe if I soften this a little, it will all be fine. And that is the edge. That is the exact moment where most empaths stall. Not because they are weak, because they are kind. And kindness, when it has not yet learned to include yourself in its circle, becomes the mechanism that keeps you stuck. The guilt is not evidence that you are wrong. The guilt is evidence that you are changing. Those are two completely different things. And until you can tell them apart, every attempt at healing will collapse back into the old pattern. So how do you tell the difference? How do you know whether the discomfort you feel is healthy guilt, pointing to a genuine mistake, or whether it is just the old program running its familiar script? Here is the question that changes everything. Ask yourself this: am I feeling guilty because I did something harmful? Or am I feeling guilty because I stopped doing something that was harming me? Because those two things can feel identical in the body. The chest tightness is the same. The urge to fix it is the same, but the source is completely different. One is your integrity speaking. The other is your conditioning speaking. And learning to hear the difference between those two voices is one of the most important skills a healing empath can develop. Because here is the truth about the people who get louder when you start healing. The ones who say you have changed, who say you used to be so understanding, who suddenly seem to need you more urgently the moment you start pulling back. They are not reacting to your cruelty. They are reacting to your absence. Your absence is only felt so acutely because your presence was so total. You were so thoroughly available, so completely woven into the emotional fabric of their daily life, that when you begin to take up space for yourself, it registers as abandonment. Not because you are abandoning them, because you are no longer abandoning yourself. And to someone who built their comfort on your self-erasure, those two things feel exactly the same. This is not about blame. This is not about calling the people in your life manipulative or toxic or bad. Some of them are simply accustomed to a version of you that you are no longer willing to be. And the loss of that version for them is real. What they are grieving is real. It is just not your responsibility to stay small so that they do not have to grieve it. So let's talk about what is on the other side, because everything up to this point has been about the unraveling, the discomfort, the guilt, the confusion, the loss. And that part is real, and it deserves to be named honestly. But it is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part of the story. The most important part is what begins to grow in the space that the old pattern used to occupy. Because here is what nobody tells you about healing at this level. It does not leave you empty. It does not leave you cold or closed or indifferent. It fills you with something you have never had consistent access to before. Something so unfamiliar that the first time you feel it, you almost do not trust it. That something is called presence. Real, grounded, unperformed presence. And it changes everything about how you move through the world. Let me describe what this actually looks like in practice, because I think the healing space does a lot of talking in abstractions and not enough talking inspections. Fix. A healed empath does not stop feeling things deeply. They feel things more clearly. There is a difference. Before, feeling deeply meant absorbing. It meant taking someone else's emotion into your own body and carrying it as if it were yours. Someone walks in anxious and suddenly you are anxious. Someone walks in heavy and suddenly you are heavy. You felt everything, yes, but you felt it in a way that dissolved the boundary between their experience and yours. You could not tell where they ended and you began. And that is not depth of feeling. That is loss of self. That is what hyperattunement, without boundaries, actually produces. Not connection, confusion. A healed empath learns to feel without merging. You can sit across from someone in tremendous pain and feel genuine compassion for that pain without your nervous system treating it as your emergency to solve. You can witness someone's anger without immediately reshaping yourself to neutralize it. You can be present in a difficult conversation without scanning for what you need to say or do or sacrifice to make the discomfort stop. You become, for perhaps the first time in your life, an actual witness, not a fixer, not a manager, not an emotional shock absorber. A witness, and witnessing, true, grounded, boundaried witnessing, is far more powerful than absorbing ever was. Because when you are absorbed in someone else's experience, you cannot actually see them clearly. You can only feel them. And feeling without seeing is not the same as understanding. Here's the other thing that shifts, and this one surprises people every time. A healed empath becomes far more discerning about where their energy goes, not stingy, not withholding, discerning. Before, the empath's energy flowed outward almost automatically. Someone needed something, and the empath system responded before the conscious mind even had a chance to weigh in. There was no deliberate choice involved. It was reflex, it was survival, and because it was reflex, it was indiscriminate. The empath gave the same quality of presence to the person who genuinely needed support as they gave to the person who simply enjoyed having someone to drain. The same emotional labor went to the friend who was growing as it went to the friend who had been in the same crisis for 11 years and had no intention of leaving it. The empath could not distinguish, because the whole system was built on responding to need, not evaluating whether responding was wise, sustainable, or even actually helpful. Healing changes that slowly, then all at once. You begin to notice the difference between someone who wants your presence and someone who wants your depletion. You begin to feel in your body the distinction between a conversation that leaves you tired but full, the good tired, the kind that comes from genuine connection and meaningful exchange, and the conversation that leaves you hollow, the one where you spoke for 2 hours and gave everything and somehow came away feeling worse than when you arrived. Before healing, you would have blamed yourself for that feeling. You would have told yourself you were not giving enough, not patient enough, not compassionate enough. After healing, you recognize it for what it is. Information, your body telling you clearly and without ambiguity that what just happened was extraction, not connection. And you begin to trust that information instead of arguing with it. This is what emotional sovereignty actually means. Not the absence of feeling, the ability to feel without being governed by what you feel. The capacity to register emotion, yours, someone else's, the energy in a room, and then choose your response rather than simply react from the oldest, most frightened part of your nervous system. Sovereignty means you are the one steering, not the guilt, not the fear, not the desperate need to be needed. You. And when that becomes your baseline, not your ideal, not your aspiration, your actual lived baseline, the quality of your relationships transforms completely. Because here is what happens to your relationships when you become emotionally sovereign. The ones built on the old version of you, the ones that required your smallness, your availability, your endless accommodation, they shift. Some of them fall away entirely, and that loss is real and it is allowed to hurt. But the ones that remain, the ones that can hold the new version of you, become something you may have never experienced before. They become mutual. You stop being the one who always gives and start being someone who also receives. You stop being the emotional caretaker and start being a participant. Equal, present, boundaried, real. And relationships at that level of mutuality feel so different from what you are used to that they can initially feel almost suspicious, too easy, too calm, too consistent. Where is the intensity? Where is the drama? Where is the feeling of being needed so urgently that it mimics being loved? And that right there, that question is one of the most important things a healing empath ever has to sit with, because urgency is not intimacy. Intensity is not depth. The feeling of being indispensable is not the same as the feeling of being loved. They can feel identical when your nervous system was trained to equate closeness with chaos and love with labor, but they are not the same, not even close. Real love, the kind that a healed version of you begins to be able to both give and receive, is quiet. It is consistent. It does not require you to perform or manage or shrink. It simply holds you. And learning to trust that quietness, learning to let steadiness feel like safety instead of boredom, is perhaps the final and most profound part of what it means to truly heal. There is a moment that happens somewhere in the middle of real healing. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with clarity or ceremony. It happens quietly, almost accidentally. In the middle of an ordinary day, maybe you are in a conversation and someone says something designed to make you feel guilty, and you notice for the first time that the guilt does not land the way it used to. It touches the surface and slides off. Not because you have become hard, not because you no longer care, but because somewhere beneath the surface something has settled, something has taken root, a kind of knowing that was not there before. Quiet, unshakable sense of your own ground. And in that moment, without fanfare, without a breakthrough or a revelation or a dramatic turning point, you realize something. You are not who you were, and you are not afraid of that anymore. This is the moment most healing content never reaches, because most healing content is built around the wound. It lives in the diagnosis, in the naming of the pattern, in the validation of the pain, and that part matters deeply. You cannot heal what you cannot name. But there is a world on the other side of the wound that does not get talked about enough. A world where the healing has moved from something you are actively doing into something you simply are. Where the work has become the way, where the boundaries are no longer something you have to consciously enforce because they have become the natural expression of how much you value yourself. That world exists, and you are allowed to want it. You are allowed to believe it is available to you, not as a distant possibility, as an actual destination you are already moving toward. So let me tell you, as concretely and honestly, I can, what that destination looks like, what a healed empath actually becomes, not in theory, not as a metaphor, but in the texture of their daily lived experience. A healed empath becomes someone who can walk into a room full of emotional complexity and stay themselves. You still feel the energy in that room. You still notice the undercurrents, the tension, the unspoken things. Your sensitivity does not disappear, but you no longer feel responsible for resolving what you sense. You can be in the presence of someone's pain without treating it as your assignment. You can feel the pull to fix and choose not to follow it. And that choice, that simple, quiet, revolutionary choice, is the difference between empathy as a burden and empathy as a gift. A healed empath becomes someone whose yes means something. Before healing, yes was the default. Yes came from fear, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as unkind. It came so automatically that it rarely felt like a choice at all. After healing, yes is a decision. It comes from genuine willingness, from real capacity, from a place of actual desire to show up. And because it comes from that place, it lands differently. The people who receive it feel the difference even if they cannot name it. There is a quality of presence in a yes that comes from choice that is completely absent from a yes. that comes from obligation. One nourishes, the other depletes both people, even the one receiving it. Your real yes, the one that comes after healing, is worth infinitely more than every automatic yes you gave before it. A healed empath becomes someone who trusts their own perception. This might sound small. It is enormous, because one of the most insidious things that happens to people who grow up managing other people's emotions is that they learn to doubt themselves when your reality is regularly overridden by someone else's version of events. When you are told you are too sensitive, too dramatic, imagining things. When your accurate readings of a situation are dismissed or punished, you learn to second guess your own inner knowing. You develop a habit of looking outward for confirmation of what you already know inward. You ask everyone around you whether your feelings are valid before you allow yourself to feel them. And that outsourcing of your own perception is one of the most painful and disempowering things a person can live inside. Healing returns your perception to you, not as arrogance, not as the belief that you are always right, as the simple foundational trust that what you feel, sense, and know is worth taking seriously, that your inner world is a reliable source of information, that you do not need external permission to trust yourself, and perhaps most importantly, most quietly, most profoundly, a healed empath becomes someone who knows the difference between love and access. This distinction is everything, because so much of what empaths have accepted as love throughout their lives has actually been access. People who loved the way you made them feel. People who loved how understood you made them feel, how seen, how cared for. People who loved your availability, your patience, your willingness to prioritize their needs above your own. And the moment that availability changed, the moment you drew a limit, expressed a need, or simply had a bad day and could not show up in the way they were accustomed to, the warmth cooled. The connection that felt so real revealed itself to be conditional on your performance. That is not love. That is access dressed in love's clothing. And once you can feel the difference, once your nervous system has been regulated enough to register the distinction, you cannot unfeel it. You stop accepting access as a substitute for love. You stop performing to maintain connections that were never really connections at all. And in the space that creates real love, the kind that does not require your smallness, that does not diminish when you have needs, that does not disappear when you draw a line, finally has room to arrive. Now, here's the part I want you to carry with you after this video ends. The title of this video asks what a healed empath actually becomes. And I have given you the full answer across everything we have covered, but I want to distill it into something you can hold, something simple enough to return to on the days when the old guilt comes back, when the old pattern pulls at you, when someone calls you cold or changed or difficult and part of you wants to collapse back into who you used to be just to make the discomfort stop. Here is what you become. You become the person who was always inside you before the world taught you that your worth was conditional on your usefulness. You become someone who feels deeply and stays whole, who loves fully and stays present, who gives generously and stays intact. You become, for the first time in perhaps your entire life, someone who is as kind to themselves as they have always been to everyone else. And that is not a loss of sensitivity. That is sensitivity finally coming home. The action from here is not complicated, but it is not easy. For the next 30 days, every time you feel the urge to explain yourself to someone who is not genuinely trying to understand you, pause. Every time you feel guilt rising for simply having a need, pause. Every time you are about to say yes from fear instead of from choice, pause. And in that pause, ask yourself one question: is what I am about to do an act of love or an act of self-abandonment wearing love as a disguise? You do not have to answer perfectly. You do not have to get it right every time. You simply have to start asking, because the asking itself is the beginning. The asking is the first evidence that something inside you has shifted from managed to sovereign, from performing to present, from surviving to finally, genuinely, irreversibly healing. You are not the empath who disappears anymore. That version of you served a purpose, kept you safe, kept people close, kept the peace. Honor it for what it did. And then let it go, because what you are becoming is so much more than what you are surviving as. What you are becoming is someone the world has not seen from you yet. Someone rooted, someone clear, someone who can hold the full weight of their own sensitivity without being crushed by it. Someone who can love without losing themselves in the loving. Someone who can be fully, unapologetically, sustainably present for others. Yes, but first and always for themselves. That is what a healed empath actually becomes. And now that you have seen it clearly, you cannot unsee it. So stop waiting for permission. Stop waiting for the guilt to disappear before you begin. Stop waiting until healing feels comfortable to commit to it. The discomfort is not a detour. The discomfort is the path. Walk it anyway. The person waiting for you on the other side of it is worth every difficult step.